Some people think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is extremely complicated. Actually, I think it is quite simple. The problem is that at its root, it is a conflict between two groups of people, two ideologies, who have each created their own narrative, their own history, their own way of looking at things, and usually they have not taken the other group into consideration as they created their own narrative. As we attempt to discern how Christians should approach this problem, we really need to be aware of both sides. People in the West are very familiar with the Zionist narrative and the views that support the State of Israel, but not so much the Palestinian narrative. In this series, I will try to give some of the history and the historical background to this conflict. The conflict basically is over the land of Palestine that you see in the map. Around the turn of the last century, this place was basically populated by Palestinian Arabs. About 4% of them were of the Jewish faith, about 10% were of the Christian faith, and the rest were Muslims, but they all thought of themselves as Palestinian Arabs. This was their reality. They were initially under Ottoman rule. Then the British mandate took over during a period of decolonization, when people were aspiring to self-determination, to independence, to freedom, to becoming a nation state. This was the reality for Palestinian Arabs. They were not really aware of what was going on in Europe and in what was basically a colonial imperialist perspective, where European nations basically ruled most of the world, the third world, in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere, and where the needs and the interests of the local population was basically secondary. What we really also were not conscious of was that Christian anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe, which has been going on for a couple of millennia, was about to culminate in a huge catastrophe for the Jewish people, known by everyone as the Holocaust. The Zionist movement actually basically grew out of this anti-Semitism. And it grew in a situation where a nation state for Jews as a people was presented as the Zionist solution to the problem of anti-Semitism. So the Zionist forces addressed the European powers, addressed Lord Balfour of the British Empire, and said, we need a state, we need a homeland for the Jews. You need to think of us as a people, and you need to provide us with a homeland, and what better place than Palestine to have that homeland. Very little consideration was given to the indigenous population. The slogan was, a land without a people, for a people without a land. The Palestinian people and their aspirations for independence and statehood was almost totally absent from the Zionist narrative. Just as from the Palestinian perspective, the Zionist movement was some adjunct of colonial imperialism that we were trying to throw off. And for us, the Zionist movement was just an attempt to create a settler colonial presence that serves the British imperial empire at our expense and at our costs, so that increasing Jewish immigration into the land and the aspiration to set up a Jewish state or a Jewish homeland in our country was totally unacceptable, totally alien. And the Palestinian people feared and resisted this inflow of Zionist and Jewish influence from their perspective, whereas the Jews, who felt that anti-Semitism was such a great evil and an existential threat, and who felt that the world was not responding correctly to their needs and to their existential crisis, they felt that the Arab resistance to the Zionist program was, in their mind, somehow an extension of this anti-Semitism and antipathy. So the seeds for conflict were already there from the very beginning. During the mandatory period when the British ruled Palestine, you saw increasing Jewish immigration into Palestine, attempts to acquire land for the Jews in Palestine, and resistance by the local population who were afraid of such encroachment and who were themselves aspiring to get independence. So that both groups gradually came into conflict, and both groups paradoxically were in conflict with the British, whom they wanted to kick out of the country and they wanted to rule themselves. This was roughly the situation during the mandatory period.